this point, I'd like to bring up Professor Ruan O'Donnell, a well-known Irish historian, a source of tremendous amount of information, particularly on the 1916 Easter Rising. He has spoke in various venues across America. He addressed the National AOH Convention in St. Louis of last year. He's a tremendous inspiration. And at this point, let's get a big round of applause for Professor Ruan O'Donnell.
I'd like to thank everyone who's been involved in this event. Obviously, it takes a lot of organising for tonight, of course, and our old friend Hugh Lunny's never ever let anybody down, but also throughout the entirety of New York State. I'm conscious that because this is an occasion which the Hibernians have sponsored, in the sense of setting it up and representing their own organisation here in so many different elements, which is quite amazing and terrific to see it. I'm going to do something I've never done before, which is I'm going to say a little bit about the AOH connection with 1916, above and beyond the general Irish-American liaison, which is more important than people understand. Now, unfortunately, the situation in Ireland is, I suppose, let's be straight about it. We've had a nightmarish history. We've had a very, very difficult past, and the trauma of the 19th century and the 18th century has reverberated due to some very significant unfinished business in terms of the structure of the Irish state. The evolution of the modern Irish Republic in 26 or 32 counties was not easy. Its gestation was violent. These issues are controversial, they're contested, they're upsetting to many people, and there's no easy way of talking about our war. But we did have a war in Ireland. We've had a continuous situation of conflict, and that's made it very, very hard indeed to do things that happen in other countries that are more politically stable. It's very, very difficult to have an agreed foundation myth in the case of Ireland. Every country that I can think of, certainly in the Anglophone sphere, has a set of values, a set of principles, a set of basic facts that are more or less agreed upon, vis-a-vis the origination of their entitlement to nationhood, their claim for self-determination, and so on and so forth. That is not the case in Ireland. And we've missed a great deal due to the reverberation of the horrendous Irish conflict through the 1970s and 80s, which terminated, at least in its major aspect, in 1998. Now that has enabled people to be a little bit more forthright about things that resonate all too powerfully. Now, it will only take me something in the realm of 3 or 4 hours to give you an outline history of 1916. And I would love to do that. It may be a series of lectures, but rest assured, and don't worry, you won't be getting that tonight. So it's going to be impressionistic, but it's going to be different. I intend to tell you things that you probably have not heard before, and I intend to specifically mention dimensions that pertain to the AOH intersection with this. Now, we have, amazingly, the living embodiment of an old Fenian in this very room, the descendant of Colonel Thomas Kelly, the Arch-Fenian. Thomas Kelly is not a name that is well known in Ireland. He should be. He was an important man. He was involved in things that were tremendously significant on both sides of the Atlantic, and not just in Ireland, in the United Kingdom itself. He, of course, was part of that generation who survived the near extermination of An Gorta Mór, the Great Hunger, what's sometimes called the Great Irish Famine, and never allow anyone to let you describe it as the potato famine. That may be shorthand for people who know nothing about it, but it's unacceptable. Now, I haven't come here to excite you and enrage you with the terrible wrong that was done to Ireland between 1845 and 1850, but let's just say that because of that, within a matter of years, the population of this city doubled and the population of Boston trebled. And that's not even the end of it, that's only the start of it. You have a hemorrhaging Irish population across the Atlantic, so that by shortly after 1900 it dipped below 4 million, having been probably close to 9 million in 1845. Now, no one wants exceptionalism. Exceptionalism is sort of a badge of dishonour. It's not good to be the most persecuted people. It's not good to be, we had the worst thing there. And it's not a damn competition, right? But in terms of the bald statistical facts, and these are facts, no other country in the Western world suffered a comparable loss. And that is simply the truth. Now, the truth can be inconvenient, because it can interfere with progressive narratives and attempts to move current affairs onwards, and I understand that. But I'm talking here about the 19th century, which is not fully reconciled in the Irish memory in Ireland itself. It is better understood here, where the dire anti-historical trend of so-called revisionism made it almost impossible to have an honest discussion about anything due to the extremity of the conflict in the north of Ireland. Now, one product of this hemorrhaging of population was the establishment of massive diasporic communities, particularly in the United States of America and Western Canada, with substantial pockets throughout the United Kingdom, mainly in urban zones, and of course Australasia. You get more exotic ones that were persisting into Argentina and South Africa, and then smaller groups elsewhere. It's a fascinating story, but it's not a happy one. The good news is there's a happy ending for the modern Irish Americans and American Irish, because from a difficult situation, you made good. So thank God for that. But one thing that did happen was, within the element that has survived the existential threat was the desire to rectify the situation in their home country. And this is what led to what can be described best in shorthand as Fenianism. Now, I've spoken here before in this forum, I've spoken elsewhere in New York and around this country, and indeed in Canada and elsewhere, and you'll be aware that my view on this is to, if you've seen me before, is to try and encourage you not to get too confused by the plethora of titles and organisations that appear to be different. I would imagine that most people who are engaged in things like the AOH have been or might be members of other fraternal organisations or other sort of social activist causes. The Fenians were avowed revolutionaries. They believed that given the extremity of the threat faced by the Irish population and the distinct possibility that lacking the ability to determine its own destiny, that Ireland required a revolutionary solution. Now this is critically important to understand. The purpose of Fenianism is not to subjugate anybody. It was never to destroy in a willy-nilly fashion the culture or the trappings or God forbid, the social structures of anybody else. It was about enabling Ireland to take its place amongst the nations of the world. As Robert Emmet said, as the 1916 Proclamation quoted. It's about enabling republican democracy, in other words, democracy, to take hold in Ireland. And it's also important to point out that while there was something called an Imperial Parliament in Westminster in London, which is a very interesting and strange beast, as it remains so, quite fascinating, vis-a-vis 1916, only a small minority of Britons or Irish voted for anyone who set foot in it. And prior to 1911, they were subject to a total veto by the aristocratic and sectarian upper house. We're talking about a so-called parliamentary construct in which there's no written constitution and no Bill of Rights. You might get away with statute law governing most things that matter in life on a day-to-day basis. But if you have no constitutional protections, you are vulnerable. Should you be worried about being vulnerable? Well, ask the 1.2 million dead people in the pits and the mass graves in Ireland between 1845 and 1850. These things do matter. And the generation who survived that were deeply traumatized. There might be something in this. We may have been physiologically affected by this. We were certainly psychologically affected by it. And with the shared experience of often chaotic refugee plummeting into this country and this continent across the Atlantic in 47, when something in the region of 70,000 people died, right? That leaves scars. There's also an aspect of humiliation. There's an aspect of dejection. These things create anger and revolutionary focus. What did they want? Fenians? A democratic, independent Irish republic. No more of your damn monarchs. No more of your no constitutions and no Bill of Rights. We want what the French had. We want what the Americans had. And this is something that had a great deal of longevity through the early part of the 20th century because it remained unresolved. The first remotely democratic election in Irish society was December 1918, when Westminster, arising out of the catastrophe of the Great War, was obliged to give all men a vote over 21 and some women. Prior to that, very few men and no women voted for a damn thing. Most of those killed in 1914 and 1915 did not have the vote. From 1916, the British were stripping their own citizens and sending them to die and to kill people just like them for no good reason. They also would not allow us to determine our own destiny, And that led directly to 1916 under American sponsorship, and of course that was the catalyst for the War of Independence. Or should I say the War for Independence, because independence was not attained. 32 counties went into the War of Independence in 1919, and 26 emerged. The 6 that were meant to revert to us did not, and with a civil war in the meantime. And many of the radical Irish in New York in the 60s and 70s and the 50s were connected to that civil war second outward diaspora, something that's not been properly documented. But I know well there are people in this room who are capable of doing that, and I encourage you to think about it. 1858, you have, by arrangement, quite complicated, furtive, the joint creation of a modern Irish revolutionary force, which is indeed a revival of the politics of the United Irishmen, but in a modern setting, in a more secure setting. And this, of course, is the Fenian Brotherhood, and in Dublin, the Irish Republican Brotherhood. Over here, the Fenian Brotherhood went through several incarnations, but is effectively the same thing. They're sometimes called Clan na Gael, and they generally are, and generally were. But the Clan na Gael was also the Knights of the Red Branch in San Francisco. There's also the Emmett Literary Society in Butte, Montana, and indeed in Portland, Oregon, where they also use the term Emmett. The Emmett Monument Association, of which Colonel Thomas Kelly was a member, was a precursor organisation of potentially armed Irish revolutionaries in this country. He, of course, was a veteran, served with distinction throughout the titanic civil war that this country experienced. And something like 200,000 Irish-born men shared that experience, and not all came out of it. My own family were involved in it. One survived with a decent enough wound to get a decent war pension. He came back to Ireland, strangely enough. He's buried up in Taney beside Dundrum in South County Dublin. But Kelly, a Galwegian, growing up in that shattered economy, took his chances on the Atlantic, did well in this country, and went back to UK and Ireland to do the work of the Fenians immediately after the Civil War. If you read some of the popular histories about Kelly, it's as if he came out of nowhere. He was simply a man who rose through the ranks. He'd been involved in this Emmett thing, whatever that was. And suddenly he decides to take the oath of the Fenian Brotherhood in this country. I don't believe that. That is not how those things happen. There's absolutely no way a neophyte like Kelly, notwithstanding his stellar war record in this country, was going to meet personally with the likes of James Stephens, the Chief of Staff of the IRB. That doesn't happen. Or if it did, it probably shouldn't. And I don't think it did in this case. So we can look at him. There's more to be ascertained. In 1866 to 1870, due to reasons I won't go into, of course, Canada was attacked. Well, what became Canada, rather, was attacked by people from upstate New York. There's a few of them in the room today, and we've been encouraged by our chair to desist from such impulses. But I do hope one day the Canadians will recognise the role of Irish America in bringing their country into being. It's a rather interesting country. I had the pleasure of speaking in Edmonton and Calgary recently, and there's some terrific work going on there. But again, it should be brought to the fore and encouraged and fostered. 1867 was the rising of the Fenian Brotherhood in Ireland, the IRB. Irish Americans were involved directly in that. They were involved in subsequent campaigns, which these days would be regarded as rather extreme, but the object was to create political instability in England rather than to target civilians. So, there's modes of looking at this dispassionately if you want to. But it's a hard sell in certain environments. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. Now, the likes of Kelly, who was arrested, escaped, re-arrested, and then sprung, having already sprung Stephens from captivity, that is classic Fenianism. It's concern for the welfare of political prisoners. This is what the Amnesty Association came from, a precursor to Amnesty International, which of course was inspired partly by Sean McBride, ex-Chief of Staff of the IRA, and a man who narrowly survived execution on more than one occasion. Now, to move on, anytime you see a memorial that says God Save Ireland, or has a catalogue of dates, like the 1916 Proclamation has, a rising every generation, that's Fenianism. That's not nationalism. Nationalism works on a different impulse. These days the word nationalism in Ireland is used as shorthand for Catholics in the 6 counties. That's inadequate. If you see the catalogue, that's the Fenian continuum. It's ideological, it's deeper than that. It's carved in stone, it means things. Occasionally the name Robert Emmet, as is the case with Pearse Memorial in Sydney, is deliberately not inscribed in memorial. Now that, by the way, to be quite frank with you, is a misreading of his speech from the dock, where he didn't want his name to be carved, like Ireland took his place amongst the nations of the earth. He didn't mean it physically. What he meant was that the Irish Republic was his epitaph. And that's why those who wanted to utilise revolution means in this country, to assist those in Ireland, their proxies and their allies and their comrades and their brothers, that's why they often call themselves Emmett Literacy Association or Emmett Monument Association. The monument is the Irish Republic. It's not a block of stone. He lived into the 20th century, as did Tom Tuitt, another original Fenian. Tom Tuitt worked for Dr. Thomas Addis Emmet, who was a grandson of the Attorney General of New York State, and one of the most important United Irishmen wasn't executed, the brother of the Robert Emmet, memorialised down beside the catastrophe of Ground Zero, to this very day, in one of the two obelisks fronting the chapel, right there on Church Street and near Broad Street. Now the Hibernians, of course, are part of the diaspora, and they've generated a different sort of momentum since then. There's a lot to be said about that, and I haven't as yet purchased any good books on it, but please get working on them, lads. I know you have a very fine natural historian and you have very fine divisional historians. I think people need to hear more about what the AOH were really about and are really about, because there's a lot of mystery and ignorance and confusion about the role. Now, I recognise that the AOH and LAOH are private organisations, and they do their work as they do it, and that's often very significant. But suffice it to say, the Hibernians had a direct role in 1916, to an extent which even I was surprised when I went looking for information on this topic. First of all, I want to give you a quick overview by reading some contemporary documents briefly, just in other words to establish that there's something to what I'm saying, that there's some evidence to support the line of analysis I'm encouraging all of you to think about. Well, there's a lot of hot air in the room, and I hope I'm not the one generating it. The AOH, right? This is what the British thought of the AOH. This is from the Times of London, okay, in November 1910, right? What do they say here? Yes, this is a report of a trip by Joe Devlin to the US and Canada in 1910, where he raised $200,000. $200,000 raised in an election tour. I wish I could do that, lads. $200,000 for the cause of the Irish Parliamentary Party, which after a period of factionalism was basically functioning again, and won its greatest triumph the following year with this type of sponsorship, which is stopping the House of Lords having an absolute veto on legislation emanating from the House of Commons, the lower house. That's why the Third Home Rule Bill happened. The Third Home Rule Bill that was never enacted in its original form, which would have given Ireland some form of devolved assembly in Dublin in 1914, had the war not broken out, was more or less bankrolled from the North America. Now that is not a conventional view, but that is a fact. That's what I want to give you. I want to give you some facts that confound the generic narrative. Here's the Times again, complaining about the likes of yourselves, right?
With pleasure.
Earlier in this week, £2,000 was subscribed by various Irish societies working under the name of the Philadelphia Municipal Council of Irish National Volunteers. It is announced that the Ancient Order of Hibernians will be the agents for collecting the funds, and committees to service the work and to arrange mass meetings in the near future have already been appointed. The British Conservative establishment were appalled by the latency of Irish America. They knew that it was so strong, so well embodied, so well represented within civic culture of the US that it could change the course of their history in a way that they could not determine. It was a capricious element as far as they're concerned. It had been described very memorably during the famine as the wolf dog of Irish vengeance. But this is not about vengeance. This is about trying to protect Irish people in their own country from the despotism that occasionally Westminster insisted was governance. To go forward to a quote from 1914 for a second. This is a letter by a Hibernian unionist to the Times. The Ancient Order of Hibernians in America, by far the largest, the wealthiest, and the most powerful of all Irish political organisations. Now, I'm not disputing that. I'm pretty certain that is a totally accurate reflection of the strength of the OAH in the 1910s. But I will say to you this, that is not reflected in the history of Ireland. That is not reflected adequately in the history of Irish America. It is not understood the significance of the groups such as your own. Now, just to give you a thumbnail sketch of where things went and how things happened. The AOH had factionalised and split from the Irish equivalent in the 1880s over issues that were described as membership related, and in other terms qualification for induction. Now, there's a lot to be said about that, and I'm not the best person to do it. I'm sure there was more to it than simply that. But basically speaking, from the 1880s you have the Ancient Order, AOH of America, and the AOH Board of Erin. Now, the Board of Erin would have represented the vast majority of Irish-based Hibernians. they also came to this country to commune with and deal with people who were from a different tendency. Now, much of this got resolved effectively in the early 1900s, effectively, but there were wobbles. One of the big questions of wobbling was, is it appropriate to support the Home Rule campaign? Is supporting the issue of John Redmond to go for Home Rule, which did not bring citizenship. We would have remained subjects within the United Kingdom, would have had a fairly large degree of local self-determination. Is that the best offer in town? And I suppose many people honestly would have believed, yes, it is. That it's not a bad solution, it's certainly a good interim solution. At one point, even Patrick Pearse, one of the most fiery of all orators and revolutionaries, he had supported this programme in his youth, that Home Rule was better than nothing. And I think it's fair to say, had there been Home Rule in the 1840s, we wouldn't have lost over 1 million of our people. But we won't know that. Now, the AOH also wanted to have its representation in Ireland itself. And this is the American Alliance. And again, this is quite obscure stuff for people who've gone through Irish primary and secondary schools. You won't be hearing about it, you won't be reading about it. So the AOH American Alliance had an envoy in the form of John Joseph Scollin, originally from Derry, but moved to Dublin in around 1911. He specifically realised that the American Constitution, the AOH, allowed for the raising of forces that might be described as small militia organisations. In other words, you could have an element within the AOH divisions that would have training in arms and indeed access to arms. I mean, in Ireland, you could not. That was rather illegal indeed, and you get yourself in a lot of trouble on a free trip to Australia at certain times, and not under the most pleasant circumstances. This, of course, is the Hibernian Rifles. Now, I would be surprised, even in this particular forum, if many people have heard much about the Hibernian Rifles. But they were a very interesting force. They were all Hibernians, selected Hibernians by Scollin and others, who had weapons training. They were involved in the labour dispute of 1913, and they worked very closely with James Connolly, with Jim Larkin and Captain Jack White, from defending Irish workers from the tyranny of the aspirant middle class, who by 1911 were anticipating controlling Ireland by virtue of dominating a Dublin-based House of Commons. Right? And that didn't happen. But this is what they were looking for. That's who the problem were. Now, Scollin and the Hibernian Rifles got on very well with James Connolly et al., who from 1913 formed the Irish Citizen Army. Now, we've heard very eloquently the 16th Proclamation read earlier. The name James Connolly sits somewhat uneasily with some other signatories of that document, including, of course, Sean McDermott, who many will realise was also Hibernian, an Irish Hibernian. Scollin et al. Saw themselves as an armed force that would defend patriotic interests in Ireland itself. They were bankrolled from the United States of America. And if you like, they were a vanguard of the US AOH in defiance of Devlin et al., who were touring looking for money for Redmond. Now, that may be a little bit complicated. And I regret to say it's going to get much more complicated now. Suffice it to say, this is not a straight situation. But the Hibernian Rifles are a significant organisation. Their sort of seed funding was $1,000. They wanted weapons from America, and that wasn't, for some reason, does not appear to have happened then, but they did get US military textbooks, which is better than nothing, I suppose. After November 1913, when you have the creation of the Irish Citizen Army, which was quite small, certainly never more than 1,000 sort of proper bona fide members, but also the creation of the Irish Volunteers, Ogle and Heron, known afterwards as the Irish Republican Army. You have two major groups which had given the Fenians in Ireland and the Klan in America what they'd been seeking for decades, a substantial mass-based nationalist Republican organisation that they could control. Okay? Now, this was devised in cities like this city and Philadelphia by people like John DeVoy. And there he is. That's not him really. He was bigger than that in real life. But DeVoy is a figure you don't hear much about in Ireland, but hopefully that's going to change with the very admirable imminent unveiling of a life-size statue to him in Naas, County Kildare, for which I commend those involved. DeVoy's right-hand man, his representative in Ireland, and therefore the representative of the Klan in Ireland, was Tom Clark, a man with significant connections to Dungannon, County Tyrone, dealing very often with other men from that rather arrestive county up in so-called mid-Ulster. DeVoy's key ally in this country was Joe McGarity from Carrickmore in Philadelphia, where you had Luke Dillon at one point, a man who could not resist dynamiting British property in British North America, and Dr. Pat McCartan, another Tyrone exile who was a very significant figure. There's another fellow in this mix who was another man who passed both across the Atlantic in many directions on many occasions, Dermot Lynch. I would say 99 out of 100 Irish people have never heard of Dermot Lynch because he wasn't shot by the British and he didn't write a big book. Lynch was here certainly every second year to attend the meetings of Clan na Gael, their conventions in Atlantic City. They had a certain public presence and they had a great deal of private business to conduct at those meetings, including the perpetuation of the Revolutionary Directory. And I'll give you 5 guesses who was on the Revolutionary Directory. Well, I'm not revealing anything I shouldn't be talking about when I say that man was in the full of his health. Now, DeVoy is often dismissed as a crank, an old fella, an old Fenian, who's always given out. Many of the younger people who encounter him only saw that side of him because they were not privy to the real business. You don't know what you're talking about, shut the hell up. Right? There's no need to, to deride the man or to give out about him. He's not going to tell you, don't ask him, you don't know, and he's not going to say anything to him. Right? Live with it, because that is the nature of this business. It wasn't casual. Yes, he's in the newspaper, he was espousing these things openly, but he was also a deadly serious revolutionary and an effective revolutionary. I would put it to you, in my opinion, there would have been no rising in Ireland in 1916 without John DeVoy. So he's probably the man the division should be complaining about, but they haven't got much to say. What they keep doing is quoting those who carp against him, who are ignorant. And unfortunately, there's a great deal of well-intentioned and also malicious ignorance involved in these things. In 1914, the Hibernian Rifles in Dublin purchased weapons. The best place to get weapons of good modern pattern uniform equipment, which could be serviced and trained in, of course, was the British military in Ireland. And that was where they got it, with the money they got from America for the most part, including the Inniskilling Fusiliers. And ironically, within 2 years, they're firing weapons bought from the Inniskilling Fusiliers against the Inniskilling Fusiliers in the streets of Dublin. Right? It's one of these awful ironies of history, which Ireland has far too many. In 1915, and I'm going to jump around a bit here, Nora Connolly, the daughter of James Connolly, was sent to meet DeVoy in New York as part of a communication with the German legation here. In other words, the consulate, the German consulate. The Hibernian Rifles paid for that. It was the HRs who paid the money used by Nora Connolly to come to New York to meet people like Sidney Gifford, who'd been here 1 year earlier, and as a person high in the councils of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and indeed Cumann na mBan, which he was a founder member, founded 2 branches of Cumann na mBan in New York in 1914, predominantly based on the ladies' AOH, right? American Alliance, not Board of Erin. So this is a fleshing out of an organisation towards an increased martial capacity. The main work of Gifford here was propaganda work, and I use that word in the best sense, in other words information, and countering black propaganda. Now that's of course a matter of perspective, but I think that's a reasonable analysis. Gifford was a very industrious person. She also dealt with Nora Connolly. It's intimate. And what you find is there's about 200 people who are in charge of everything. A lot of them in this country, and a lot of them are in Ireland, but they're the 200 who are in charge of everything. There are many people around them. They had influence in key organisations, including all the ones you'd expect. And of course, when it comes to fundraising, who are the Irish going to be organised by? There was no real necessity of having Oakland Heron, the volunteers in the US, but it was here. It was in the city. It was in Philadelphia, Chicago, and elsewhere. It was. And they were members of that organisation, not with a view to fighting in Ireland, but basically, getting ready for whatever role might be suitable. The early generation of Fenians had intended to literally fight personally in Ireland, but that's a different matter. So the politics of this thing was changing very rapidly. And to summarise, basically, between 1897 and about 1905, many important things happened, which in retrospect are revealed as being very significant. One was the British Famine Queen visited Ireland, and that didn't go down too well with people like James Connolly, Countess Markievicz, Mort Gone, etc., but went down quite well with some Dublin royalists. The fervent response by some Dublin royalists, particularly in Dún Laoghaire, was sufficient to antagonise the greater bulk of the population. So sometimes it's useful to have a fool out there with a Union Jack, but that's what they want to do. They're entitled to it. I mean, there are many Irish people who thought Ireland should be the British Empire, and it was a respectable point of view They could see the value of being in the United Kingdom and having access to an imperial sort of construct. I get it. It's just not the tradition that my family followed. So in any case, I don't think anyone should have a monarchy, but that's their business. I don't have one, nor do you. It's only because this idea of hereditary authority in a bloodline that's sectarian and anti-democratic, it doesn't appeal to my democratic nature. But anyway, I have nothing against them other than that. They're a perfectly decent German family. Well, to move along, you have the Jubilee fiasco. You have 1898, when you have the centenary of Wolfe Tone and the United Irishmen. Big deal. Unfortunately, this country was engaged in the Spanish-American War, and the hundreds of thousands who had planned to travel to Ireland to take part in our celebrations, the other side of the Atlantic, couldn't go because of shipping issues and the lack of. It was deemed to be unpatriotic to travel in wartime, so they just wouldn't do it. And I needn't tell you, an Irish American is as fervent a patriotic American as anybody, so they weren't going to do that. In 1903, you have the centenary of Robert Emmet, a man very much revered in this country, and nearly all the famous images of Emmet were produced in the United States and imported back to Ireland for two reasons. The Americans wanted to do it, and you weren't allowed to do it in Dublin. There's two reasons there. 1900, Local Government Act, very boring, but quite important. It meant that you allowed people in places like Limerick, where I live and work, were allowed to vote for your own damn Lord Mayor, instead of having some unions imposed on you. So the Catholic middle classes took over the towns and cities of nearly all of Ireland, with some notable exceptions. Who's the first Lord Mayor? John Daly, the Fenian, the friend of Clark. Later, of course, intermarried with Tom Clark through his niece. Now, Daly was the most important Fenian in the province of Munster and the province of Connacht. So between the glue of Tom Clark marrying Kathleen Daly, you have a marriage connection of deep politics, of blood, of aspiration between the Dalys, the Clarks and Devoy. And through Devoy to McGarity, to Ryan in Buffalo, to Keating in Chicago, to Mannix in Portland, Oregon, and many others we don't even know who they are, right? Because they never said much about this. This is a gigantic story, but again, there's only 200 people in charge of everything, I would say, something like that. Now, the greatest contribution that O'Donovan Rossa made to Irish history was probably not trying to blow up the House of Commons. The dynamite campaign that he was a key figure in and Tom Clark took part in, against the wishes of Devoy. They weren't always on the same page. They wanted the same thing but would disagree over tactics. This is a classic situation that afflicts Irish organisations, right? And it shouldn't induce panic that people have different ideas about tactics, right? Any big organisation is going to have tendencies, personalities, factions and elements. This is the norm. So don't freak out, right? Just don't go far enough into a new. Don't make another AOH, right? One will do fine for the moment, right? And broad church organisations tend to do better than those that are factionalised internally, at least in terms of capacity. Now, in this story, which could get terribly complicated, but I'm not going to let it do that, the Irish volunteers became so important that John Redmond had to control them. And his avowed view was, we know this, and he was unabashed about it, was either to control them or to destroy them. Eventually, Bulmer Hobson, a Belfast Protestant and advanced Republican, temporarily acceded to a deal that enabled the Redmondites to seize control of the executive. Now, still under the command of Owen MacNeill, who was Fenian orientated, and with the likes of Clark around him. Clark, when he was sent back to Ireland in 1907, and he was sent back. Yes, it's true, his properties were not doing as much for him as one might have expected in Long Island, but he went back having taken out US citizenship. There's a fair bit of groundwork done here. And bear that in mind, it's a simple point that gets glossed over. The lead signatory of the 1916 Proclamation, who was executed by the British, was a US citizen, right? One of the guys who laid the groundwork for the massive gun-running operations planned and commissioned from Germany was Dermot Lynch, who was also a US citizen and a long-term resident in cultural and political organisations in this city, such as the Philo Celtic Society, the American Irish Historical Society, and others. And of course, he was the key clan envoy on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, I'm just trying to say to you, allow some ambiguity, allow some room for lapses in our knowledge. We don't know everything, we never will. But just to go on to O'Donovan Rossa. When he died in Staten Island, I know there's people here who are very interested in the history of O'Donovan Rossa, and indeed he deserves to be rememorialised, I think, at some point. When he died, he was curious, albeit infirm. He'd been dying for 15 years, Took a while for him to shuffle off his mortal coil, and I'm sorry he's gone. I wish he was here with us. He's in spirit, I suppose. When he died on Staten Island, his family immediately understood the importance of his legacy. Now, 1915 was not 1900. We now have organisations capable of forcing Westminster to either do the right thing or else. I haven't mentioned the pro-British element in Irish society, the very small minority of those who formed the Ulster Volunteer Force, but they were locally very strong in the northeast of Ireland, and they had powerful backers, including the Guinness family in Dublin, boycott their products anywhere apart from O'Loney's. You have, I'm joking. But they did provide a substantial tranche of money in Dublin for the arming of the UVF, so thanks for that, Arthur Guinness. You had the Milner, the man who brought us the wonderfully successful Boer War, so thanks for that horrible conflict, imperialist idiot. You have Churchill's father, who died from syphilis, unfortunately, but quite a rogues gallery. And don't worry, I'll spare you any more details. That's as much as I want to know about the Churchill family. Suffice it to say that in death, his survivors in this country realised that O'Donovan Rossa was potent. And they allowed him to be restored to Ireland, not to be buried in Cork as had been intended in the Skibbereen area, but to be buried in Glasnevin Cemetery in Dublin amidst some aplomb. Now, he was put in an iron casket. That casket has been recovered. It's in the process of being restored. It's been identified and is being restored. So we'll have some sort of tactile remnant of this extraordinary episode. Irish Americans, obviously the Klan, arranged for it to be filmed. And there's 2 films of that funeral. It's 1915. People weren't filming very much. The Klan had their own film, which they showed here in this city in 1916, after the execution of the Patriots, and Pathé News, or their equivalent, had a different one, which is in the general run of public interest, which was shown all around Britain and Ireland, because it was extraordinary to see a paramilitary funeral in Dublin on the 1st of August 1915. And it was a paramilitary funeral. This is where Pearse gave his famous oration in the uniform of Oakland na HÉireann. In the crowd, out of uniform, is the chief scout of Na Fianna Éireann, the Republican youth organisation that Clark had steered in concert with Bulmer Hobson and Countess Markievicz. I could go on, but just you get the idea. Who provides an honour guard? The Hibernian Rifles. The American Hibernians in Ireland provided an honour guard, and that is something again that gets glossed over because they were in the Republican family. Now, I was going to read you some resolutions of conventions of the AOH in places like Portland and Chicago in 1910 and 1914. But for the purpose of tonight, I'll gloss over that for right now. But believe you me, they were absolutely in favour of what could be described as the advanced nationalist position. In other words, a robust home rule and then something more. And that is from the resolutions passed by the AOH in 2 national conventions at this time of reorganisation. In fact, they are basically quasi-republican statements, which is peculiar, because that wasn't what the Irish Board of Ireland AOH were doing. The Devlin Knights, etc., were nervous of the UVF, and particularly Devlin's power base was in Belfast. He had every reason to be nervous about the capacity of organised loyalists to basically get in the way of Westminster, their own so-called government. The conditional loyalty of elements of the Irish population, that part of Ireland, is quite extraordinary, but they were potent. And from, in briefly, April 1914, they were well armed, due to a massive weapons importation from Germany, which was facilitated by the authorities themselves, who decided not to utilise their legal authority to interdict them. It was semi-legal, but they engaged in legal devices to do it. Then, of course, the government brings in an absolute ban on arms to stop the Irish volunteers emulating them. Well, they did emulate them, and they used money obtained by DeVoy and McGarity. I could say quite a lot about that, but the seed funding for the mission of Erskine Childers, Conor O'Brien, Molly Childers, who was a Bostonian, and others, Niall Osgood from Boston, using the Asgard, the wedding present of her rich Boston father. They're not all wasps up there in those days. That was utilised very successfully, along with 2 other vessels, to run guns into Kilcool and Howth, in respectively in Wicklow and Dublin, between the 26th of July 1914 and the following week. Total success. It shouldn't have worked, but it did. Who receives those weapons at the pier in Howth? Well, there's a 20-minute window of landing to do with tides at that time of the day. Cathal Brua and members of Irish volunteers who were also members of the Fenians secretly, and also in the Fianna Éireann who were a Fenian front, and also Cumann Amon, who I now believe, contrary to the established record, were also a Fenian front. And if you want to hear me talk about that for 2 seconds, bear with me while I give you a quick explanation. On the 25th of November 1913, those of you who know Dublin, Óg na hÉireann was founded in the rotunda at the top of O'Connell Street, right, beside the Ambassador Cinema, and in that complex, near the oldest maternity hospital in the world. A very significant building is utilised by the Irish volunteers in the 1770s, who were American patriots. They're pro-American patriots. So there's all sorts of legacy here. There's all sorts of continuities and ideology, which I won't even go into. At the same time that they did that publicly, having privately, secretly met to decide who's going to be elected at that meeting, which is the way these things go, a group of women, including Sidney Gifford, met in Wynn's Hotel, where they effectively founded Cumann Amon on the same night, but didn't do so formally until the following April. Fenians. That is Fenianism. That is not just nationalism, that is Fenian republicanism. What happens when Redmond in September 1914 decided that with the onset of the catastrophe of World War I, that the volunteer movement, which he basically controlled, should join en masse into the British Imperial Forces? Expect it all to be over by Christmas, I suppose. Expecting it's on the books, we're going to get home rule. Jesus, John, wake up. I think that poor man, and I mean this quite seriously, I think he was deranged at the time of his death, because some of his decisions are so irrational, some of his lack of consultation with the other executive members of the Irish Parliamentary Party are so inexplicable that he must have been out of his mind. There's something else going on there. So Redmond's Wooden Bridge speech in County Wicklow, where I was 2 days ago, believe it or not, it was such to cause consternation. I would say something like 80%, maybe 90% of the volunteers accepted this call, in terms of either going to the front in British uniform or dropping out, or basically taking a step back. The other 10%, I am very much under the control of Tom Clark, secretly, through people like Patrick Pearse and others. They were the ones who wanted a rising. They were the ones who had the lines of communication with Clan Miguel, and they're the ones who had all the money from America. It's very, very noticeable that after September 14, the money raised in this country was not being funneled to the Irish Parliamentary Party. It was vastly disproportionately be channeled to the small element, maybe 10%, who were under the control of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And of course, that's exactly what would happen. Now, where did that money come from? Well, it came from public meetings. It came from Irish fraternal and female organisations. And they're going to be individual Hibernians doing that, because they were the biggest, the wealthiest, the most influential, according to the Times of England, and they must know. Now, the sign that the Irish Fenians were going to go for it, with the backing of New York, Chicago and Philadelphia, at Buffalo, etc., was given by Pearse when he more or less politely declared war in England at the grave of Dublin Rossa, which was filmed and shown everywhere. I can't resist reading a bit of this, and I hope it won't lead to flames spontaneously erupting in the decor. Can you imagine Pearse there in uniform, with the dead Fenian in his casket, with an honour guard of Óg na hÉireann and the Hibernian Rifles, with Cumann Amon present and the Fenian Éireann present in uniform and out of uniform, and he passed on this rather shocking statement: "Life springs from death, and from the graves of patriot men and women spring live nations. The defenders of this realm have worked well in secret and in the open. They think that they have pacified Ireland. They think that they have purchased half of us and intimidated the other half. They think that they have foreseen everything. They think that they have provided against everything. But the fools, the fools, the fools, they have left us our Fenian dead. And when Ireland hold these graves, Ireland unfree shall never be at peace." Now that's the declaration of war. The treasurer of the volunteers was, of course, Roger Casement, the great anti-imperialist and Irish nationalist and Republican, of Protestant and Irish ancestry, of Dublin and County Antrim associations, which are profound. A man who came to believe that the British Empire was maybe not quite as savage as the Germans in Southwest Africa, or the Belgians in the Congo, or indeed the Putumayo against the Putumayo in the Amazon Basin, but was nonetheless illiberal, wrong and ill-conceived. So Casement was out here with McGarity in Philadelphia waiting for news of the successful landing of guns in Coast, County Dublin on the 26th of July 1914. That meant that he knew something that no one knew in Ireland, exactly when and where the guns were arriving. As soon as that happened, having proven the capacity of the volunteers to do the work, the allied work with the clan, he received $4,000 more. Ultimately, at least $100,000 was channeled to the Irish-based Fenians working in close concert with their American cousins. Very important. The money raised briefly by Alice Stopper's Green Circle in London, a loan of £1,500, which was used to pay the Germans to get the 1,500 weapons on the Chota, on the Kelpie and the Asgard. That loan was secured against Don Devoy's money, and it was paid back. They paid back Alice Stopper's Green's friends for putting up the money, but it's secured by the Americans. So at time and time again, where it really matters, what you're looking at here is an effective transatlantic conspiracy. Now, conspiracy is a word that has negative connotations, but if the conspiracy is to bring into effect the proclamation we've heard, and it was, it's progressive, it's modern, it's dynamic, and it's still relevant. It's still relevant. What is wrong with guaranteeing religious freedom and civil equality in a country where there was no such thing? What is wrong with that? What is wrong with raising Irish people to the status from subjecthood to citizenship, where you are guaranteed protections normal in this country and indeed in France and some other putative republics? Well, the countdown to 1916 is something that I won't go into right today. This is only the 99th anniversary after all, and maybe you might let me back in the country next year. I'll see what I could do there if you want. The rising itself is a tremendous affair, and it starts not with shooting people, but the reading of that proclamation. The appeal to the exiled children in America is actually an appeal to exhort them to get Washington DC to recognise the Irish Republic. Now, I won't tell you a lie. They wanted the French government to do the same thing, and they wanted Berlin to do the same thing. Okay? But the US in 1916 was a neutral country. Ireland was fully combatant within the British Empire, but the US was neutral. It was not by any means a foregone conclusion, with the strength of the German lobby in this country and the Irish lobby in this country, that it would join the war at all, or even significantly facilitate what could be described as Allied cause. Of course, they did, under the very stringent terms of the 14 points, which were the death knell to gunpowder diplomacy by the British. The 14 points made it impossible for the British Empire to regulate itself at the force of heavy guns off the coast of weak nations and emergent nations. So make no doubt about this. The American entry of the war damaged the British Empire, possibly fatally, as well as the transfer of credit from London to New York City, and the creation of New York as the world's significant financial centre. Now, that was partly engineered and certainly encouraged by Irish Americans in the Democratic Party and in the various civic ordinances across this colossal country. The rising itself also involved your organisation, those of you who are Hibernians. The Hibernian Rifles played an active role in it. They did so because of the bonds between Scotland and Connolly. They knew from Easter Saturday, which of course is the 22nd of April 1916, that something was up. On the night before, casement had been captured off the coast of Kerry, Bannockstrand and Kerry. The weapons that were meant to be landed at Fenian Pier in Kerry had been intercepted by the Royal Navy due to code breaking, not treachery, but very sophisticated code breaking. Carl Spindler had scuttled the odd armed ship off Don's Rock, thinking that, well, at least I won't let them see what we have here, which is a very brave thing to do. And with that, McNeill did not believe a rising could succeed. And when he realised that people like Thomas MacDonagh, one of the architects of O'Donnell Ross's funeral, by the way, and not just a poet, I'm not being a poet, and not just a playwright, quite a serious intellectual, and the titanic quiet figure, Sean McDermott of Leitrim, and indeed who was also a Hibernian, when he realised that they were manoeuvring with Pearse and Clark to have a rising anyway, because that is what had been understood with Devoy and agreed with the German authorities in the US, in New York City, in San Francisco and in DC. It's quite an interesting story there, and it's again not very well known. He tried to stop them rising. The Scotland immediately said, well, we're going to go for it. And more than half of their entire complement, I'm being told, we weren't planning to have a rising, but our friends are going for it, our comrades are going for it under these circumstances. Do you want to do it? And more than 50% of them did. They saw a lot of fighting, by the way. They're right down across from City Hall, where at that point recaptured by the British forces at the gate of Dublin Castle. The real seat of the British authority in Ireland, of course, was Dublin Castle, not the decommissioned Parliament House at College Green beside Trinity. They fought there, and in one particular attack by elements of 2 different regiments, and sadly Irish recruited regiments, they inflicted between 23 and 24 casualties on those forces, utilising various forms of weaponry. Now, here's an interesting aside. Were American supplied weapons utilised in 1916? And I'm here to tell you, yes, they were. And again, this is not something people know much about. There's various sources about this. I don't propose to go into any great detail about it. But speaking after the Rising in in Chicago, James Larkin, who'd been one of the key people to project the Irish Citizen Army, very strange man, Larkin, by the way. He had a very peculiar political evolution, but that's his business. He's long dead. You won't mind me saying it now. But at that point, Larkin, as a radical trade unionist and a Connollyite, I suppose a hint of a wobbly about him, more than a hint of a wobbly about him, he revealed that one of the people who'd been involved in sending weapons to Ireland for the Rising was one of the Spring Rice women whose brother was a British ambassador to America. Now, they're obviously connected to Mary Spring Rice and other Irish patriots of various heritages, but that's quite something else. The British authorities realised that 200 rifles or thereabout had been sent from America by Clan Gael via Glasgow to Ireland. And the Irish Citizen Army also had at least 20 American supply shotguns. There was a lot of dribs and drabs of weapons coming in, and we don't know the full extent of it, because these things often remain deep in the murkiness of unrecorded history for obvious reasons. But there are signs, I think evidence, I regard that as evidence, that some American-supplied weapons were used in the 1916 Rising. The lead signatory was Thomas Clark, an American. All of those involved in the upper leadership of the Republican movement in those days had American ties. Pearse had spoken under the Klan auspices in 1914 across the city and then up and down the eastern seaboard, very successfully in raising money. Some for the school and some for the weapons, right? During that tour, he was joined by Bulmer Hobson. Now, if you're saying you're over here talking about, the very admirable project of progressive education at St. Andrews College, that's fine. But if you have Bulmer Hobson standing beside you, another Fenian emissary, it's quite clear that people know what the story is, that it's not all going for school books. Also in the US in 1914, the early part, Dermot Lynch with Thomas Ashe. Ashe, the first great hunger striker of the 20th century, forced out to death by his British captors in 1917 when hunger striking for political status. A key Fenian issue. Not criminals, political prisoners. Maybe not prisoners of conscience, but prisoners of ideology. I suppose a prisoner of conscience is a political man without a gun. They were all for the weapons in the cause of asserting Irish democracy. Not to take anything from anybody, but to raise everyone to equal status. That is not tyrannical. That is not terroristic. That is not coercive. And unfortunately, had the Irish Parliamentary Party been able to prevail properly, it may not have been necessary. But they did not, and they were stopped in Westminster. The Rising itself, which I'm not going to go into any great detail, as I said to you, went on for 6 days. Dublin City was left destroyed. The commercial heart of the city, all the major buildings, including what's now the Winds Hotel, had to be rebuilt. Cleary Store destroyed. The GPO itself in rack and ruin, because they didn't just use infantry weapons, they used heavy support weapons. They held a gunboat, okay, lobbing shells at a very sort of high arc, fairly indiscriminately in the Connaught Street sector, but not just that, also batteries of artillery used in the grounds of Trinity College Dublin. I presume it's where they now play cricket. Well, I hope they remember what that site was used for in 1916 next year. I have a feeling they won't. We were the ones getting creased, no pun intended, actually pun intended. Dublin was destroyed to save it. What had been the second city of the empire. Bitter but impressive city fighting. And many of the British forces in Dublin fought with great courage and tenacity. There's no doubt about that. They were also fighting in built-up areas which they had no training and no instinct. They were meant to be dying in fields and trenches, not in fighting in towns. The first thing you do in Flanders is you get away from the town and you entrench. Right? You don't fight in cities, not in those days. So the volunteers proved to be extremely good at it. The Irish Citizen Army proved to be very, very good at civic fighting, and indeed so were the Hibernian Rifles. Now they only lost one man dead, Edward Rolfe, right? But one is more than none, and that was very unfortunate. According to Scotland's eyewitness account, they may have inflicted over 20, 23, 24 casualties on British regiments. They were there throughout. He was lucky to survive execution after capture. Had he been recognised for what he was, the OC of the Hibernian Rifles in Dublin, when captured, he could have been summarily executed. My wife's great-grandfather survived summary execution by being shot at but not hit, but his two comrades were taken out by the British, having escaped from the GPO. The rest of Scotland up in Broadstorm, in the north side of Dublin, big transport hub, and a very Fenian area of Dublin, by the way, traditionally going back to the time of the United Irishmen, just like the south inner city of the Liberties, also a very Fenian area. They didn't know who he was. His bluff held up long enough not to be sentenced to death and not to be high enough up the roster to be shot, as 15 men were. And later the 16th was added in London in Pentonville Prison, Roger Casement. Casement had been here, Pearse had been here, McDermott had been here. Joseph Mary Plunkett was claimed from quarantine in arriving at Ellis Island by Devoy himself, with Senator Gorman. He was here on the business of Germany. Casement travelled from the US via Montreal to Germany. Plunkett has come back from Germany to New York to liaise with that nation. The point of the 16th Proclamation was to gain the recognition of the Irish Republic under advanced, I believe, admirable democratic principles. That's my personal opinion. Most people probably can't disagree with that if you're democratic, but I'll leave it to you. The purpose of the rising was to make certain that that voice would be heard. And I'm going to finish by saying something that's also slightly controversial, which is this. Under the circumstances under which it was triggered, the 1916 Rising stood no chance of military success. It did have the capacity to deliver temporary control of zones of Ireland, including the national capital, deposed or not, to the cause of the Irish Republic. That should have been sufficiently significant in the eyes of the world to have our aspirations for liberty recognised in a war that was meant to be about the self-determination of small nations. It was not for us. And that is why we have a war of independence. And sadly, that's why we had a civil war and suffered the crime of partition. These are the legacy of the 20th century that still haunt us, and they are being addressed in various means, and hopefully there are better days ahead. Those better days ahead, should they come, and we have to assume that they will, Irish America, as always, has a critical role to play. And do not be disheartened if you do not find, under the index reference, the full extent of transatlantic connectivity. Believe you me, it's there. I've only scratched the surface, and I'm finding more material than I can possibly process. So the job of work to be done by many people on many fronts in the future. I encourage you to do this. Thank you for organising this event, and please remember 1916.
First off, does anyone have any questions for Professor Ruan O'Donnell?
We have July 4th in this country. The French have Bastille Day. The Mexicans have Cinco de Mayo. Ireland has no Independence Day. And I wonder if Dr. O'Donnell might say what effect that might have had on the psyche of Irish people going forward.
Okay, that's an interesting question about the Ireland's lack of a constitutional day. There are people in Ireland who believe that the 24th of April should be declared a constitutional holiday in Ireland, and I support that on the grounds we don't have one. This is my personal opinion. I'm speaking in a personal capacity. It's the day in which the 16th Proclamation was read, and as such, at least rhetorically promulgated, aspirational though it was. It should have been sufficient to, I suppose, to achieve the desired result. But it's the closest thing we have to the American Declaration of Independence and to the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, which it explicitly is in the tradition of. It also is a reiteration of the unknown Proclamation of 1803 of the same title, which Robert Emmet had issued, which Pearse knew very well. So, in answer to your question, I think it is damaging that we don't have a constitutional holiday that is well observed in the Irish state. And hopefully, my personal view is there should be in all 32 Irish counties, but that's where I'm coming from.
Okay, we're only going to have a few questions. This gentleman in the back.
Thank you so much, Professor. Outstanding. It's great to hear from an Irish patriot. In your opinion, when can we expect to see the unification of Ireland?
Wow. Well, that's the hardest question you could possibly ask. So thank you, my friend. I appreciate your goodwill. I've been asked about when can we expect to see the unification of Ireland, or actually, as I often point out, without being pedantic, the reunification of Ireland. Ireland was always a country. It is a country. There's 2 states in Ireland. 26 counties are in the Republic of Ireland since 1940s, and of course there's the 6 contested counties. The Good Friday Agreement has undermined some of the British unilateral claims to these counties. I think that's a fact. There are cross-border bodies, and there's a recognition that Dublin has a legitimate interest in extending its influence throughout the entirety of the national territory. The strength of the constitutional claim in law was weakened in 1998, but the aspiration to achieve it has not been diminished, in my opinion. We're living in interesting times where there's a different realignment of political forces in the mainstream of Irish politics, and we could see quite important issues in the future on that. I would note, by the way, that if one, and it's not a good argument to my mind, but if one is convinced that demography alone should decide such issues, the trend in the north of Ireland is incredibly encouraging. Because basically speaking, those who might be described externally as nationalists or Republicans are very well on the verge of becoming the majority in that political sector. The vast majority of people under 18 years old, more than 60%, are already nationalists or Republicans. Now, whether or not that will translate into a voting bloc in 10 or 15 years, I don't know. What happened in terms of the Scottish aspiration for constitutional severance from Westminster is telling. And I think people need to take cognizance of the issues surrounding the way in which that vote was organised, and it was, I suppose, combated by the traditional conservative tendencies in London, which is their perspective. I mean, it's their country, they could do these things. I'd imagine the Irish situation would be somewhat more fiery than that, but nonetheless, Ireland unfree shall never be at peace. And while we have relative calm in the north, when we have a relative period of peace, it would be absolutely appalling if this was not used to build towards a lasting final status. Sorry.
We'll take one more question. The gentleman here with the hat.
Ruan, I'm going to ask this question on behalf of Billy McGuire. You know Billy?
Oh, yes, I do. Yes.
The president of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. Mm-hmm. He wants to know what happened to the Vaughan's Hotel papers that he donated to the University of Limerick in Willowbank House. He said he cannot get an answer from them. Yeah. He blames Tom O'Donnell of Fine-Gael TD. Okay. He says that he won't give him an answer. He won't tell them where they are. And those are the founding papers of the Irish state, correct?
I believe so. I haven't seen them myself, but I believe that to be the case. This is a rather controversial issue, and I'll have to be very careful what I say about it. But I won't dodge your question. This is a reference to the role of the McGuire family, who were deeply involved in the Friends of Irish Freedom in this side of the Atlantic, and in the maintenance of the Irish Republican Brotherhood in Dublin, particularly from 1917. I gather Billy McGuire has informed me that important family papers were donated to the university, where I work, by the way. They're not catalogued, they're not available in terms of access, and I accept his words that this has happened. It's something I can look into, but I don't know the answer. Certainly, if they are as significant as Billy mentions, then they definitely deserve to be in focus.
Wow, that was a phenomenal lecture by Professor O'Donnell, very clearly outlining the contributions both morally, financially, and in arms and men to the 1916 Rising. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you.
And we look forward to continuing your research and having more facts for us next year.